It started with small refusals. Not cruel, not deliberate, just the kind that leave no mark on the surface but deepen something underneath. I'd ask her to come out for coffee after work. She'd smile, that polite reflex kind, and say maybe next week. I'd wait. Next week came, and she'd forgotten. Or pretended to. I couldn't tell. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. She worked in the office down the hall. HR assistant. Always early. Always perfectly composed. She had this way of straightening papers that made everything around her feel quieter. Like they are slowed down for her. I'd pass by her desk and say good morning. She'd look up, nod, smile, always the same distance in that smile. I thought I could close that distance if I tried enough times. So I tried. I kept trying. The first time I asked her out properly, she left. Not mockingly. More like she didn't register it as real. Like I was playing at something harmless. I said I wasn't joking. She said, softly, that she didn't think it was a good idea. Then she apologized for saying it that way. I remember that apology. It sounded heavier than it needed to be. That night I drove home in silence. No music. Just the engine humming low, the headlights carving tunnels through the fog. I told myself I was fine. But the quiet had edges. I could feel them pressing in. I started noticing her more after that. The rhythm of her footsteps when she walked past my door. The sound of her voice drifting through the hall when she was on a call. She never raised it. Even when she laughed, it was muted, like she was keeping something small and private inside. I admired that restraint. I thought maybe she was like me, cautious, measured. I mistook that stillness for depth. Every few days I'd try again. Sometimes a question. Sometimes a compliment. She'd deflect with small talk, or she'd just nod. That polite, finished gesture that meant there was nowhere else to take it. I started paying attention to the details. How her tone changed slightly when she spoke to different people. How she'd fidget with the ring on her finger when someone stood too close. I never stood too close. I made sure of it. But I watched. I noticed. That was enough for a while. Until it wasn't. I began leaving small things on her desk. Nothing personal. Just things that looked like coincidence. A coffee she liked, placed by the corner of her keyboard before she arrived. A note about a meeting she'd missed, written in careful block letters. She'd glance around when she saw them, puzzled, but never asked who left them. I liked that, the quiet exchange of something unnamed. I told myself she understood, that she appreciated the thought. One evening, I stayed late. She did too. The office emptied out slowly, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the air thick with that post-work stillness. She was at her desk, finishing something, her eyes fixed on the screen. I stood in the doorway for a moment, then walked in. She didn't notice right away. When she did, she looked up, startled but not frightened. Just surprised. I said I thought we could talk. She hesitated, then smiled a small, tired. Said she was heading out soon. I said it wouldn't take long. I asked if she ever thought about me. The question hung there longer than I meant it to. She blinked, as if trying to find a safe place to put it. Then she said, carefully, that she liked working with me, that she respected me. The word respect landed like a dull thud. I nodded, said I understood. She looked relieved. I wasn't. Something cold settled under my ribs that night. A kind of steady, dull quiet. I didn't sleep. I lay there watching the light from the street cut across my ceiling. I tried to picture her asleep. Tried to imagine what her breathing sounded like. The next day she avoided me. Not obviously. Just small detours, taking another route to the break room, turning away in the hall. I didn't blame her. I thought it was just her way of setting boundaries. I respected that. I told myself I did. But boundaries are porous things. They shift if you watch long enough. One night, a week later, I drove past her apartment. Not on purpose. Or that's what I told myself. I just wanted to know if she was okay. Her lights were on. Curtains open slightly. I could see her moving inside, slow and hurried, pouring herself a glass of wine, sitting on the couch. The way she tucked her legs under her, the way she leaned her head against her hand, it looked like she belonged to that space completely. I realized I didn't belong anywhere near it. And yet I stayed. Just for a minute, watching. I wasn't thinking of anything then. Just existing in that suspended space between want and refusal. The next day, She smiled at me again. Polite, cautious, like nothing had happened. That's when I knew she'd already moved past it. And I hadn't. I started keeping track of our conversations, writing them down after work. Not to analyze, just to remember. The things she said, the way she said them, the pauses, the silences. I told myself I was documenting something important, some kind of pattern. But what I was really doing was building a map of her absence. Each note was a reminder of a door that had quietly closed. By the end of the month, I stopped asking her out. She looked relieved. I told her I'd been acting strange lately, that I was sorry if I made her uncomfortable. She said it was fine, that she hadn't thought about it much. That last part stayed with me. How easily she could not think about it, about me. I realized then that I had become background noise, a shape in her periphery, something harmless and threatening, forgettable. I thought I could live with that. I was wrong. That was when the silence began to shift from rejection to something quieter, heavier, a kind of patience. I didn't know it yet, but that was when I stopped waiting for her to see me and started watching instead. I stopped speaking to her after that, but silence didn't make her disappear. It only made her sharper in my mind. The less she said, the more I heard. The less I saw her, the clearer her face became. Every small interaction replayed itself in fragments, looping in quiet hours when the world had folded into itself and left me alone with the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of settling walls. I told myself I was over it, that I'd learned my lesson about wanting things that were never mine. But the truth had its own gravity. It kept drawing me back. I started thinking about the space she occupied, not her apartment, not her desk, the emotional rooms she took up in other people's minds. I wondered how many of them thought of her when she wasn't there. How many she smiled at the same way she smiled at me. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was something quieter, more resigned. Like realizing a song you thought was written for you was just one verse among dozens. I caught myself tracing her sentences in my head, the way she used certain words, careful but never cold. I'd lie awake repeating them, not because I wanted to, but because they wouldn't stop echoing. The repetition became a kind of comfort, predictable, safe. I started writing less about her and more about myself. The notebooks filled up quickly. My handwriting changed to smaller, tighter, neater, like I was trying to compress something large into something manageable. I wrote about the first time I saw her, the way she laughed at something someone else said, the way I felt invisible in that moment and strangely calm about it. I wrote about the silence after she turned me down, how it had a texture I could almost touch. Each word I wrote felt like pressing against a bruise to see if it still hurt. It always did. There was a point when guilt started mixing with fascination. I wasn't sure when it began. It came quietly, like dust settling. I felt guilty for wanting her to notice me, guilty for being angry that she didn't, guilty for imagining conversations that never happened. But the guilt was strangely grounding. It reminded me I was still capable of feeling something real, even if it came twisted. Work became easier, almost mechanical. Numbers, reports, signatures, they all blurred together, and that blur was a relief. The predictability of routine wrapped around me like insulation. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of her in the hallway, just long enough to know she was still part of the same world, but distant enough to stay out of reach. That distance started to feel natural, necessary. I learned to breathe in it. My coworkers noticed I was quieter. One of them asked if everything was fine. I said I was just tired. That was true in a way. Tiredness had become a language I understood. It said everything I couldn't. I spent nights walking around my apartment, not really doing anything, just moving from one room to another, tracing patterns in the carpet with my eyes. The silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was almost companionable. I could feel my thoughts slowing down, softening at the edges. That's when I realized how much of myself I'd poured into her without even knowing. How much of my identity had been defined by the chase, by the waiting. Without it, I felt lighter, but also hollow, like something had been pulled out too cleanly. Sometimes I'd think about apologizing again, properly this time, not for what I'd said but for what I'd turned her into inside my head. But the thought never made it to action. It wasn't her forgiveness I wanted. It was proof that I still existed in her memory, even as a mistake. That seemed worse, though, to ask for remembrance from someone who had already learned to forget. The guilt deepened, became less about her and more about the shape of the emptiness she left. I began to understand that what I wanted was not her attention, but the version of myself that existed when I believed she might give it. That possibility had kept me upright. Without it, I drifted. Nights stretched longer. The clock on the wall became a heartbeat I couldn't sync with. I'd sit on the couch staring at nothing, thinking of small things, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the sound of her shoes on tile, and realized they meant everything once and nothing now. I started forgetting parts of her face, but the feeling stayed. That's how fixation changes shape. It becomes less about the person and more about the echo they leave behind. I tried deleting her number once, but my hands hesitated over the screen. Not because I planned to use it, but because erasing it felt like admitting the story was over. And I wasn't ready for that. Some nights I imagined what she'd say if she knew. Maybe she'd be kind, maybe uncomfortable, maybe nothing at all. The not knowing kept the illusion alive. I learned to live inside that uncertainty. It was quieter there. I think that's what I'd been chasing all along, not her, not even closeness, just quiet. The kind that doesn't judge, that doesn't demand resolution. I told myself the worst was over, that the weight would lift. But some weights don't. They just learn to settle in new places. Time did what it always does. It moved without asking. Weeks folded into months, and her name became something that passed through conversation like dust. I heard she'd been promoted. Someone mentioned she was seeing someone new. I nodded, smiled, said the right words. It didn't sting the way I thought it would. The ache had flattened into something quieter, like the hum of an appliance you stop noticing. The guilt, the wanting, the watching, all of it dulled to a distant vibration. I began sleeping again. Not well, but enough. Dreams came in fragments, soundless and gray. Sometimes she appeared in them, but never as herself. Just outlines, gestures, movements that looked like memory trying to imitate life. I'd wake up before dawn, the world still half dark, and sit by the window with a cup of cold coffee. There was a comfort in the stillness before morning, a kind of truce. The apartment was silent except for the pipes sighing in the walls. I realized I'd stopped expecting anything to happen. That used to frighten me. Now it didn't. There's a freedom in the absence of anticipation. It leaves you weightless, but also untethered. I thought about calling her once, not to speak, just to hear her voice again, to know it still existed somewhere beyond the noise of memory. But I didn't. I knew what silence meant now. It wasn't punishment. It was the end of a conversation that had gone on too long. At work, I saw her once in passing. She was with someone, laughing. The sound was faint, almost brittle, but real. She didn't notice me. I didn't stop. I didn't even turn. The world didn't collapse. It just kept moving. That night, I came home and turned off my phone. I sat in the dark and listened to the city breathing outside, cars, wind, a dog barking somewhere far away. I waited for something to rise, some echo of the old pull, but nothing came. There was only stillness. It didn't feel like peace. More like exhaustion that had finally run out of places to go. I thought about the first time I met her, how bright everything had seemed. I thought about the last time she spoke my name. Then I let those thoughts pass. It wasn't forgetting. It was allowing. Letting the memory exist without reaching for it. Sometimes, in moments between sleep and waking, I sensed that version of myself, the one who waited, who hoped, who mistook distance for depth. He feels like someone else now. A stranger I might nod to in a crowd but never stop for. I think that's what growing quiet really means, not peace, not closure, just recognition without reaction. Tonight, as I write this, the clock shows 3:14. The world outside is asleep, or pretending to be. The hum in the walls has softened. The air feels heavier, slower. I'm not sad, not relieved, just here. Breathing in the dark, counting the spaces between sounds. This is what remains when the noise ends, not triumph, not regret. Just the faint pulse of a life moving forward, and notice, steady, almost still.